A Conversation with the Eye, with a few appearances by the left ear, by Andrew Bruff. Read by Andrew Bruff. Chapter 1. The Habits of a Most Unassuming Middle-Class Man of Blainesville. Where is it that we dare to begin a story so unsettlingly strange, even as outrageous as this? Where is it most proper to begin a tale so profoundly bizarre and confounding that any sensible practical person would dismiss it as purely speculative hogwash at prima facie? Well, these kinds of discussions are perhaps best suited for an extensive, involved narrative that would entail disclosing the histories, accounts, dreams, and dialogues of a host of very strange characters. But let's not get in over our heads just yet. Indeed, it appears that a hasty summary will merely render the poor reader confabulated and distraught. Such anecdotes derive from oddly disconcerting circumstances that it would be daft to begin so thoughtlessly and lead the reader down a rabbit trail of false promises. As the narrator, with an adequate knowledge and history of the aforementioned characters, I believe it is my duty to provide you with only the superlative information feasible, and it is probably optimal to begin in the time span of, say, a week in the life of our main suspect, Mr. Cameron Lewis D. Telm, more informally referred to as Cameron, in a time when things began to alter drastically for him, beginning in the midst of a typical day. It was precisely 12 noon when our Cameron was immersed in a demanding series of insurmountable tasks. He was a few years shy of middle age, by all accounts average-looking, with remarkably intense dark eyes and even some mildly chiseled features, with aptly combed yet greasy dark hair, which was lined with traces of premature gray, while ill-fitting glasses with several evanescent scratches hung dubiously from his nose. He was a little under average height, but made up for it with a somewhat stocky build, but was by no means overweight. Upon first glimpse, one might surmise him to be quite muscular, but it was merely the way he was built. Abruptly, swinging up from the desk in a state of vigor, he remembered that he was required to make several copies of the legal proceedings from yesterday's courtroom sessions, which had been unforgivingly bombarding his desk for the past few days. Management had often implicitly done such things without directly telling Cameron, as if the hefty stack of almost 200 or more papers served as a clear sign of importance. This was only a typical portfolio for a workflow such as his. It was Cameron's duty as legal aid and file clerk in the law firm offices in which he worked in downtown Blainesville to properly copy, organize, and consolidate paperwork, and most imperatively, bring said documents as filed to proper proceeding authorities in the attorney offices located across the street. He rapidly located a folder for his paperwork and left the copier room to be met with the drab offices, which were inelegantly ordained with tacky wallpaper and cramped corridors, in which there was scarcely enough room for more than one person to squeeze through. Lastly, air conditioning, which was especially subpar for Cameron as he worked in a room which did not have central air, so he had to take to propping the windows up. Management did not like this one bit, in securing himself via a small electric fan which often just spewed dust particles into his eyes rather than the much-needed cool air. His eyesight was bad enough, he thought. He didn't need that of all things to be any more aggravated than it already was. Cameron was someone who thought highly of his job, so highly in fact that he made it a habit of showing up an hour early every morning, something which his superiors didn't notice in the slightest. Furthermore, he rarely turned down an opportunity to work overtime, even having moved his residence to 3 blocks down the street in order to be all the more readily available. This came as particularly strange to most people in Blainesville, well, at least the west side of it, which had an infamous history for being one of the worst cities, in terms of poverty, sanitation, or lack thereof, to live throughout the region of West Principia, according to not only many travel magazines, but the general consensus of many luckless people who'd crossed its dispiriting paths. But in order to be fully acquainted with such a city, we must provide a cursory investigation in history. You see, anybody who knows anything about the puzzling and eccentric city of Blainesville understands two momentous details. The city was split into two sides. The east side was fairly well off in both commerce and technology, and had an electrical grid that scarcely failed them, and boasted a fanciful array of lights, especially on its market strip, with all the storefronts of every shop plugged in their most vivid neon lights for everyone to see. No one can miss a thing when such a creative display of color and light that was even visible from an aerial vantage point. It was even turned into an unstated competition as to who could provide the most stylistic and entertaining exhibition of merchandise and ornamentation. It seemed that every day was Christmas for the east side of Blainesville. However, the other half of the city was a sorry-looking assortment of gray suburban houses, with the main streets of the town showing off a few shops, and whatever trade was occurring was in the more seedy parts. People are often surprised when they look at the more good and proper side of West Blainesville, as even the best houses are barely passable by most health administrations, dealing with low-class trucker bars and brothels, as one could establish from the dim yet constantly faltering neon lights that spat out sparks much like a devilish fairy waving a wand of cheap pleasures, while regaling travelers with promises of all kinds of vices. Even the less ashamed citizens of Blainesville preferred to keep this section in the dark. That is not to say that we should heartlessly condemn such people. More than anything, it is a sad sight to witness a city once so unified and promising to devolve into such hostility. It was only a symptom of the petty divisions and greedy intrigue of the city leaders and politicians that slowly altered an admirable city into a negative, unsanitary place. The city was divided through the middle by a landmark barrier, while the river Insipity passed through both sides. This river served as a wall of division and symbol of unification at the same time. Some days one could see members of both sides crossing freely over the Roosevelt Bridge, passing each other with no qualms. However, most of the time, there was a perceptible veil of inhospitality and paranoia on both sides. Other times, especially in the more sordid parts of the river where pollution was rich and the current was volatile, it could drag an unsuspecting person into the riptide and spew him into the larger tributaries that were linked, leading out into larger bodies of water. There were other sections, however, that were so full of fresh water and vegetation on either side that it stood out admirably among the gaseous clouds of industrial smog that arose from behind it. People took to calling the murky side of West Blainesville Rat Town, due to the ubiquitous status that the rats occupied, to such a degree that people often joked that they were on a 1-to-1 ratio with the humans. This was the dismal setting that R. Cameron regrettably inhabited. He often pondered if he could ever truly make something of himself in a place such as this. Seeing the sheer magnitude of failure, arrested development, lack of property value, and injurious harm around him on a daily basis, he set out to make something of himself, and to carry himself in such a way as to be impervious to the atmosphere surrounding him. He wanted to set himself apart from the seemingly endless propagation of failure surrounding him. There was a certain group of people in West Blainesville who had a shameful habit of extracting a particular substance that very much resembled a valuable gemstone from the outskirts of factories and reselling them. These same kinds of people were also prone to stealing and promptly reselling car parts, such as tires. The pattern of these crimes was so predictable that the West Blainesville Police Department were distinctly aware of it, but their attempts of enforcement could do little to stop them, partially due to their own notoriety for ineptitude and unprofessional conduct, and to their often not taking these crimes into consideration. Some officers even doubted the veracity of these claims, and even contemplated launching an investigation of the matter. This too, however, wouldn't do much to solve the problem. Regrettably, these crooks would merely stop altogether for a few weeks, regather, and go out committing their petty crimes again. There were also the types that would take advantage of the unfortunate elderly folk in Blainesville, often calling and masquerading as an insurance firm demanding an upfront payment, or better yet, rectification of a long overdue medical bill. Alas, many of these poor elderly people couldn't tell that they were being scammed, and often would capitulate to these shady demands. Oftentimes, these types of con men did their work unabashedly in the open, forming a mob-like entity in the local diners and restaurants. Cameron wished them no harm, but he didn't congregate with them much, only passing them in silence. Aside from the rat infestations, pollution, cons, and thieves, West Blainesville was an average town in many respects. It housed teachers, lawyers, doctors, artists, politicians, and a host of other interesting characters. It could not be solely defined by its faults. Any time one witnessed a shameful, illegal act occurring, there was likely to be an act of civil compliance and charity following it. There were home builders piecing together forms, retail store owners trying their best to revivify their businesses, teachers going the extra mile to offer their best to the students, regardless of the troubling circumstances around them, community organizers attempting to rebuild the shreds of the precarious glass around them. In short, while West Blainesville was certainly a discomposed city with a heavy unrest, Its citizens were trying with defiant resolve to ameliorate the problems around them. The aforementioned Insipity River, on the other hand, had the unique ability to bring unlikely blessings upon the city. It was as if it had a life of its own, on one hand transferring pollution and hazardous waste to perfectly healthy areas, and other times bringing the unlikeliest of people together. One notable occasion being when the well-known recluse, Mr. James Gersher, poked his head out the window one day to see the gorgeous rainbow stooping from the clouds right over the Insipity, as though it was beckoning him over. When he arrived at the Franklin Bridge, smiling ear to ear, ready to stroll through the city, which he rarely ever did, his eyes caught the sight of one of the most beautiful creatures he had ever seen, even more comelier than the rainbow he set out to marvel at. Her name was Claudia, and she lived out on the west side of Blainesville. He approached her, yet was hesitant about talking with a member from the other side. Nevertheless, observing her charming allure, the kindest, most tender eyes, and her long dark hair flowing delicately on her shoulders, he managed to overcome his fears and began talking to her. The conversation came naturally, and they spoke about everything that was on their minds, something that was often said to have been impossible by the snobbier members of both sides. Before long, they were better acquainted and eventually married. Though they moved out of Blainesville altogether, it was not from any malice, but through the magnitude of heart and spirit that they changed the atmosphere of the city. She complimented him by getting him to be more open and affirmative, and he in turn helped her to become sharper and pragmatic. It was a wonderful connection, but nevertheless, we digress. The point is that a city such as this not only brought those two together, but was also capable of bringing such a severity of dissension and misery to its other residents at other times. Sometimes violence broke out in the streets. Gangs of vicious thugs would wander around the town square where the hub of markets lay, looking to smash into store windows and steal goods. One often wondered what in the name of God West Blainesville had done to deserve such a nasty fate. Was the city cursed? Were the inhabitants doomed, inextricably tethered to their destiny in this despondent, wretched city without even the meagerest light to shine upon it? As dubious as this sounds, the good people of West Blainesville did not end there. In fact, Cameron was neighbors with half a dozen men and women who occupied a halfway house across the street. They were pleasant people by all means, and they often could be heard singing, laughing, having all sorts of get-togethers, many of which Cameron was invited to. However, there was a noticeable strain with some of them. Many of them had been or were in the midst of drug use, a tragic, harrowing habit, and endeavored tirelessly to better themselves, often working overtime. For instance, there was one woman in her 30s who had a 10-year-old son, who meant the world to her, and stopped at nothing to care for him. The landlord of this house, however, ruled with a hostile air and often threatened to evict them without cause. Cameron offered his own place in case such a thing were to occur, and even tried to reason with the landlord himself, but found him invasive and difficult to locate. The houses surrounding Cameron had chipped, brittle paint peeling off in slabs, their little ponds filled with unclean, murky rainwater, home to countless mosquito eggs. The screen doors were kaput, and they basically had broken off the hinges, which were considerably rusted as well. One could, if one was so inclined, peep inside these homes and discover that the interiors did not even do the exteriors any justice, as there was no shortage of stained carpets and rugs pitted with tears, walls which dripped with condensation, especially over the summer months, with droplets taking shape and defiling wallpaper, which peeled off by itself as the mold formed on it. The corners were mortised, and the doors, though antiquated, actually looked less appalling than the rest of the home. These old-style doors had brass handles and fashionable design patterns on them, as though most of the occupiers didn't bother to stain or waterproof them, and the doors seemed in league with everything else. Nevertheless, Cameron didn't try to judge the state of these old homes. He knew about the cultural, more particularly the architectural factors that had bred these conditions, which not only were generated by a lack of renovations and remodeling, but also the fact that the original structures themselves had often been built in a disagreeable style not meant for future scions. This dissuaded contractors from attempting to unveil the initial facades in new sidings, which so often revealed even the uglier truth underneath. Decrepit crawl spaces made of half-rotted wood bespattered with old lead paint, along with a variety of items that had once been useful but were now abandoned in place. Thus, this onward cycle of concealing one's troubles was left unmended, and many of these once dazzling houses of West Blainesville, not just the upper side, but in all areas, were left to ruin. A number of schools were given the same treatment. If one were daft enough, they could be quick to blame all those who ran the city, primarily the city council and mayor. However, one need only examine the situation slightly further to discover that most of the responsibility could not be borne upon them alone. There were plenty of reasons why the city's infrastructure was such a failure, and while the more exact details could entail a quite extensive document that would no doubt intimidate the reader, and more specifically lead us away from the main focal point of our story, regardless, it is possible to summarize the significant factors. Much of the city's unfortunate conditions could not just be attributed to the apathetic, anomic individuals who refused to give back to society, nor could it be blamed upon the greedy politicians who wanted nothing more than to fill their pockets, though this was certainly an issue. Neither could it be distinctly placed on the overarching governmental powers, who could dictate an array of social programs, available health care, the healthy flow of harmony of family-owned businesses, as opposed to massive franchises and rightful land ownership. These were all very pertinent, necessary things in their places. However, it was a different kind of fault that led to these blunders. It all boiled down to the intentions of the individual. There is one simplified, if not reductive, way of addressing this issue. Let us say that there is a localized produce farm in peak season with plenty of manpower to run it smoothly. Now, let us fancy that these folks experience no droughts but only the most agreeable weather, offering both bountiful rain and sunshine. Keeping all this in mind, let us suppose that they experience an enormously subpar harvest with scarcely anything to show. Many from the ground up, such as politicians, not only in Blainesville, immediate region, and a considerable amount of the country, would claim that the reason why many farmers couldn't grow seeds in peak summer season was not because of any vicious politician trying to confiscate the crop shares, although this no doubt might be an issue. As they would probably put it, nay, if the farmer cannot reap his share, he has only himself to blame. Let he who hath not work not eat, as it says in the Bible. Yet, in reality, Blainesville was a different story, one best confronted as a much more complicated issue. This often entails arriving at the root of the issue, one of which has constantly evaded not only Blainesville folk, but concerned people from all areas. You see, without getting too doctrinaire or senselessly moralistic, let's pretend that the farmer hasn't taken the proper initiative and is in the wrong. But even if he did, he or she would probably be thwarted by the meddling hands of another, and then the original innocent intention behind the wish to farm in the first place would be contorted into something entirely different, and thus they would be worse off as a result. The original version of the founders of a once small rural town was not one strictly occupied by like-minded mill workers and blue-collar folks, but a diversity of teachers, leaders, planners, architects, and many others, all harmoniously living together without dissent. However, it would be untruthful to assert that the majority of those inhabiting the streets of Blainesville weren't blue-collar types. As time progressed, the east side of the city became more accepting of technological innovations and the general perks of modernity, while the west side was notoriously less accommodating of these developments and preferred to remain seated in their traditional ways, keeping old buildings pretty much the same way. This decision didn't necessarily lead to the property's decrease in value. In actuality, there were plenty of old buildings in East Blainesville that remained intact aside from the required renovations. However, the West End's community refused to refurbish much of their property, leaving many otherwise valuable homes and even schools to decay. As sensible, understanding people, it is not our job to judge the choices made by both sides and whether or not West Blainesville would have been better off for agreeing or not agreeing to said advancements. It should be said that as thoughtful yet doubtfully flawed people, we should not make it our business to impart any lesser qualities or disparage anyone for their choices. With this caution in mind, we can analyze the reasoning behind the choices and circumstances that shaped the city. In short, it was redolent of a kind of a mimetic desire, the kind of which Rene Girard spoke of, that led to so many city members wanting to mimic the old ways, which didn't establish order in the city, as they had once imagined, but instead following suit in the malice and the contempt that would one day lead to its ruination. It was with unknowing, hasty animosity that the city men and women began to gnaw away at the so cautiously knitted fabrics of the city to slowly upturn all the progress that had once defined it. Keep in mind that these kinds of people only comprised about 10 to 20% of the city, although it's nearly impossible to draw a precise number. However, they had provoked a circle of mimetic discontent that, as Girard summarized again, chiefly focused on a scapegoat figure of some kind. In other words, they wanted to place the blame not on themselves, and not to find the one who is blameworthy to just a feasible degree that they could effectively exorcise the collective guilt that had badgered them for so long. In this same motion, they singled out senior citizens immigrants, politicians, military, and just about anyone who is noticeably different. Hence, they maintained a circuitous pattern, and no one dared go against the grain and oppose them. It must be noted that it was a kind of insulted circle of like-minded people that did such things, that it spread contagiously like a virus of bad ideas. There just wasn't simply a meaningful connection between the citizens of West Blainesville as there was in East Blainesville, and this contributed heavily to the tendency for each side to paint the other as a kind of scapegoat figure, a collective substance, albeit abstract in nature, onto which they could superimpose all their fears and insecurities and gain a cathartic release. This projection of skewered, misinformed resentment onto somebody or even something, unlike yourself, was often a misguided way of distracting yourself from one's own dilemmas. As such, the cycle of propagated malevolence continued without any antidote. In Eastern thought, time is proposed to be cyclical. The Hindu Vedas and the Upanishads speak of the 4 yugas, or periods of time which the universe goes through, with each one lasting 4,320,000 years, or 12,000 divine years. Each epoch entails an entirety of creation, birth, death, and destruction and rebirth. Each cycle ends only to begin anew, and these time spans are almost unfathomable to us in the present age. Additionally, Hindu traditions state that we are currently in the 4th age, or the Kali Yuga. Nevertheless, we can glean from each faction of Blainesville, with all its perceived insular eccentricity and petty problems, can be seen as part and parcel to these vast yugas of time. One version holds that these 4 stages represent human involution, loss of identity with our fleshly bodies and inner selves, that we have 5 variations of bodies, named the gross body, the breath body, the psychic body, and the intelligence body, and the bliss body. Another myth asserts that they represent the loss of holiness over time, that beginning with the Satya Yuga, meaning truth, there was only righteousness. By the second, Treta Yuga, we have lost a quarter, and by the third, the Dwapar, it was half. Now, by the Kali Yuga, we only have 3/4 remaining. However, in an age where self-adoration and effervescent New Age positivity practically reigns, the notion that mankind is congenitally flawed and even wicked may come off as disconcerting, to say the least. Admittedly, such inadequate summaries of Vedantic myth and Girard's well-known theories are embarrassing at best, flawed at worst, and I will not pretend to convey any expertise. After all, as the narrator, I can and ought to make things just a tad clearer and shed some light onto the obfuscated dark void of a story. Also, as a narrator, I can and ought to supply some rationale for why a city like Blainesville had fallen so far from grace, and to do so without thoughtlessly insulting or misrepresenting its residents, because Blainesville is a city that had its distinct attributes and obvious faults, yet was also a collective of individuals who are wholly inimitable and unique, and who deserved the best credit feasible. After all, there were people trying their best to get by in a town that had unfortunately let them down. In short, the reason why such negativity abounded is that violence only breeds more violence. Apathy breeds apathy. What else can be said? Additionally, there was a lack of individual, strong family bonds that often set children right in the world and inculcate them into abiding in lawfulness and honesty, rather than taking advantage of expedient methods and pursuing shallow pleasures. It seemed that there was scarcely any people of note to come out of West Blainesville. Certainly, there was Todd Wentworth, who had become the city councilor and later mayor, but he had only lived in Blainesville in his youth and had been sent to a prestigious preparatory school, and later a law school, far away from the district. Even the people who made it in Blainesville don't want to admit it, was one phrase that traveled around, and it was truer than one would like to admit. There appeared to be a great stigma about identifying with the city or having any roots there. Regardless of whether you personally wished to distance yourself from this derelict town, its smell came back to haunt you, no matter how far you traveled, or even hid from it. This was similar to what Cameron felt, an undeniable anathema mixed with confused adulation for the city. He loved its simplicity, unswavering, consistent, rustic sensibility, irregular yet unique terrain, and occasionally easygoing people. Other times, he resented the overpowering, looming air of misfortuned certainty, that uncivilized, in-your-face confidence that took the shape of graceless piles of chewing tobacco, obscene graffiti and bad taste, vandalism for no other reason but to see what smashed glass would look like, the garish neon lighting that blinded you rather than beckoning you over to the places of business, and rows of stores with tapered windows, cracked floors, and ever-increasing plumbing and heating issues, not to mention the cheap dive-in bars and strip clubs that attracted droves of desperate men with strained and loveless marriages, if they had any left at all. There were, of course, some people attempting to thrive in a town where hostility and tactlessness was the unspoken rule. Sometimes Cameron would see such people putting in the extra effort to paint over tasteless graffiti, shift the garbage that accrued in heaps, or rectify the absence of many traffic signs. The latter were also victims of graffiti, not to mention the morass of bustling citizens with nothing to signify when they ought to cross busy streets, meaning they were often almost struck by oncoming vehicles. Pedestrians often cited the fact that one of the most common accidents in Blainesville was collisions that luckily resulted in broken bones. I only say luckily due to the fact that they could very well have been killed. Now, we have clearly deviated from our introduction to Cameron in the midst of his day. I only offer a thorough background on Blainesville because of the immeasurably complicated and peculiar nature of the place. If we were to insert ourselves right into Cameron's life without a rudimentary insight into the circumstances, peoples, and ideas that defined it, I would be greatly remiss. Though these insights are admittedly hortatory in style, I do not intend to prescribe moral absolutes. The intended goal is to bring Cameron's story to life, this most unique string of events that are doubtlessly worth recounting, and to impart to the reader the reasons for them. Now we may return to where we left off. Cameron was markedly more affluent and successful than many of his neighbors, but despite this, he did not wield it over them with a vain pride. He took some degree of pride in his work, but he saw no need to be a braggart, and he chose to retain his modesty above all else. In short, he was an anxious person and a perfectionist to the point of servility, but he did his job well, resourcefully and without protest, and that's what mattered to him most. Cameron's absent-mindedly musing was interrupted by a thundering cacophony of footsteps ringing throughout the office, followed by a crotchety, high-strung, gravelly voice. It could only be one person, Cameron thought, Mr. Charles Singer, his supervisor at the law offices, whose job was to fire up the employees, in which he took a certain sadistic pride, retrieve and oversee pertinent documents, meet with clients for a hearty breakfast, to which office workers were never invited, set order in the office, and enforce proper pay and regulations. He was a great big man, wide in girth but not morbidly obese, just rather dense and heavy. Moreover, he wore an eye patch from an unscrupulous bar fight in his youth, though he swore on his grave that it was an honorable war wound received when he was manning a machine gun and was pounced upon by an unsuspecting rogue enemy conscript who cut his left eye with a knife. However, even his deepest friends weren't convinced of this obviously tall tale. He had a commanding stentorian voice that echoed and reverberated so intensely that when he spoke at his regular volume, it was often loud enough to be heard 2 buildings away. Cameron felt especially anxious whenever Mr. Singer reared his chubby head into the offices as he did every day precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning. Not only was tardiness on anybody's account impermissible to him, but any feasible flaw or a breach of conduct would also be rapidly snuffed out. Even if he was in the right, Cameron shook in his shoes on his co-worker's behalf when he saw that Singer was about to give his morning speech. No one was left unscathed by his daily haranguing, and he was always scanning the small crowd of employees, mostly old women and middle-aged men, keeping his good eye on any insurgents who dared not abide in a proper code and conduct. The offenses varied depending on the mood, which was particularly dependent on whether he was well fed or not. That typically ranged from a lack of tie-wearing to signs of minor drunkenness. They were punishable by a variety of disciplinary measures. This is where he got creative. For offensive conduct in speech, for example, you would be dismissed from work for 2 weeks sans pay and to have your pension temporarily put on hold. It was an almost diabolical puppet show in which he, the master of all, could snip just about any string he saw fit simply because his temper, which operated entirely on a whim, saw it as fit to do so. "I just had an intimidation of it," he would say. Of course, he likely meant intimation, but it made no difference to him. He could elect to speak a made-up, gibberish language completely on the spot, and everybody in the office would surely nod in utmost compliance. Cameron's quaking did not stop. Instead, it worsened as Mr. Singer began to talk, or, more accurately, brawl. "Ladies and gentlemen of the office, good morning. I have some important information to announce to you all. The Dual Attorney Company will be updating its official company policy. From here on out, the rules are no on-site napping, no tardiness under any circumstances. This was gospel. A man who was even late in a family emergency was fired on the spot without hesitation. "No gossiping or discussion of events that would be injurious to our job. No personal visits. No exceptions. No casual footwear in the office." Just as he belted out this statement, his fierce, shifting, black beady eye, which was surprisingly tiny for a man his size, scoured the room vigilantly and saw right away that 2, perhaps 3 people weren't adhering to the code, and he had just gambled on donning tennis shoes. His mouth fell open and his eyes became inflamed with rage. "I'll be damned! We already have not 1, not 2, but 3 people who think that the rules are just for fun and that nobody should actually follow them because, well, that's just too damn difficult, isn't it? Isn't it, Mr. Hardy?" An uneasy, thin man arose from the ranks and responded cautiously. "With all due respect, sir, Mr. Singer, you introduced this new policy only today, if I'm not mistaken, and we've worn our casual shoes here before with no qualms, sir." He looked somewhat ashamed of himself for bringing this up, but he felt that he had a sense of duty to his fellow employees. Mr. Hardy was an affable enough man, very easygoing, with a penchant for obeying orders, albeit with a considerable sized chip on his shoulder. For instance, when the company had first introduced the policy that expelled all superfluous family photos or personal items such as plants, pictures, instruments, or books that could end up causing, quote, unnecessary division and envy in the much-needed order in the Blainesville District Law Office, where we need eager workers to cooperate and have their minds on the task now more than ever, unquote, Mr. Hardy had snuck in a few paintings that he had craftily woven into the background existing plants. Sure enough, no one noticed, but he had continued to take the paintings out at lunch, so he could have at least one object that he himself could exclusively appreciate, sans the nosy interrogative supervision. Unfortunately, Mr. Singer had many eyes around the office to make up for his own deficiency. Several snoops had been sent out to search and appraise every possible area, including Mr. Hardy's little downstairs desk that sometimes resembled a grotto with its trove of seditious bootlegged items. Once they located all of his paintings, they had dug even deeper into his cubicle and found magazines, CDs, cassettes, movies, and even snacks. The nerve of him! This was surely enough evidence for the verdict of high treason. Alas, Mr. Singer had ordered him to remove all said items from the office immediately and suspended his promotion. "It could be worse," Mr. Hardy said placidly. "At least I still have my job." If only Cameron had a fraction of the composure that Mr. Hardy displayed under Mr. Singer's tantrums. A brief silence followed. Cameron's stream of thoughts was interrupted as Mr. Singer bellowed, "You impudent, idiotic, subversive, slimy weasel with no respect for anyone! You think I make the rules just so you lazy, unappreciative worms can spit them out and forget them as soon as I talk about them?" He paused as if expecting an answer, but it looked as if everybody's tongues were tied. "What I am saying is truth. When I say something ought to be done, I mean that it damn well should be understood, employed, and damn right done by the time I finish exhaling. I don't introduce the policy just for show, and I sure as hell don't do my job so that grimy, inept fools can challenge every word I utter." His face was now beet red, his eyes crimson, and veins were popping on his head. "It may sound ridiculous, but I'm doing this because deep down, well, I respect all of you people. And my definition of respect is doing the right thing. And that entails occasionally whipping you into order. How can somebody have any respect for people who refuse to do their jobs? I know I wouldn't have any for myself if I didn't do what I do. Oftentimes, the image of love is a teacher slapping the wrists of his students, so that they'll listen, obey, and execute everything they intend to set in motion. Without this structure, we are formless, shapeless, and useless. All of this starts with listening and obeying." Mr. Singer's voice dropped in magnitude when he said this, and his eyes appeared to fill up with a slight tenderness, so no one could discern if this was contrived or sincere. This was understandable, as his behavior would appear as wholly out of control, abusive even to anyone with a semblance of humanity. However, we must understand that the employees had been dealt a very bad hand. The only reason they had chosen to stay with Mr. Singer's firm was not out of deliberate self-torture, but because they simply had no other choice. You see, the west side of Blainesville was not only significantly impoverished, but the class differences were so stark that it was not hyperbolic at all to assume that if one decided to quit this particular job, they would end up in the same category as those who hadn't any work or skill at all. It was an immeasurably difficult situation, and a deeply challenging for any inhabitant of the city to find backup work, side jobs, or work that paid even minimum wage. Mr. Singer began again after wiping beads of sweat off his forehead. It gave everyone some quiet satisfaction to see their own supervisor suffer from the lack of air conditioning when he had brushed off their complaints about it so many times.
When I leave this office, do not forget what I said. I expect everyone here to be ready to work every day, wearing the exact accepted outfit. I know what you people are up to when I'm gone. We have CC cameras installed in every room, even the bathrooms. You think we can't see you? Think again. Next time, I'll install even more cameras, ones that go inside your cubicles. You may think I'm crazy, but the only thing I'm losing my mind about is getting the work done. No socializing in the break room when on the clock. No personal calls except in a dire emergency. Do I make myself clear? And damn it, Callum, what do you see wrong here?
He looked straight at Cameron, who didn't even dare to correct the misnomer, as he didn't want to agitate him further. Yes, sir. I'm not sure I see anything, wrong, sir. Not that I know of.
Think again. You're not wearing the policy-approved magenta-colored tie. Rectify that as soon as possible. Remember, bold, assertive colors. And you've been here how long? 2 years?
14, sir, said Cameron, struggling not to make his correction seem invasive, although he believed it would put him on better terms if Mr. Singer was aware of his experience.
Very well. Fix it. Let's get serious here.
Cameron exhaled and didn't even bother to challenge Mr. Singer, only nodding profusely with his hands behind his back as if he were hiding even more flaws from him. But there was no use. Mr. Singer seemed all-seeing, all-knowing, and all-present. Of course, he was also wrong about the magenta tie. There was no such rule in effect, yet, and there was certainly no available evidence of it. No employee handbook, no printed catalog. It simply spewed from Mr. Singer's mouth and was venerated as ultimate truth, as was so often the case. The office was his kingdom, and he was the ruler who enforced brutish laws with an iron fist. The subordinates were his subjects and vassals. To say that this man was wrong was to insult him. He would react with such wrath that everything short of physical abuse would be displayed. Now, admittedly, it was rare for anyone to contradict him, but the ones who did suffered the consequences and told everyone of their experience with a degree of shock that promptly implored them not to do likewise. As the reader will soon discover, there are more reasons as to why this was. Not only were the classes so disparate, but those poor souls employed at Mr. Singer's firm were aware of a certain state of mind that was accustomed to putting up with such working conditions and ruthless behavior due to the particular way in which they were brought up. Here we venture into the territory that is obscure at best, as many working-class folk of Blainesville, especially the west side, were notorious for their unwillingness to share what was on their mind. It is an oddity that many people will perhaps never fully understand, yet it is one of the very defining characteristics of these unique folks. Thus, Cameron had found himself years earlier thrust into a herd, this word is used dispassionately, of like-minded people who did not dare question the antics of upper management, which already had the seeds of oppression and maltreatment decades before. So they chose to be silent. They thought that if they withheld their opinions, refrained from protest, and simply focused on the work, they would excel, and eventually, and it didn't matter how long, people like Mr. Singer would be sated. However, that day never came. Protests and union were occasionally considered, but never fully sought out. It was always a matter of who spoke first, when it pertained to an organizing en masse and voicing their dissent. From their points of view, if one person were to resist, they would be snuffed out and be dealt with. If 2, perhaps 3 were to do so, it would take some work, but they would be positively fired. However, the thought of being fired was tantamount to a kind of death before death, and because of Blainesville's generally cloistered, isolated setting, there was a kind of patriarchal system of leadership rooted in honor that was somewhat similar to those seen in district paterfamilias in both Japan and early Roman societies. Likewise, the closed-off nature of the city made for a uniquely terrifying ability of the upper, more elite classes to crack down on the lower without being reprimanded. As you already know, the police department of West Blainesville were infamously unreliable. For instance, on one occasion, an officer was patrolling the Upper West End when he stumbled upon a display of volatile behavior, claiming to have seen figures wielding firearms. So he immediately called for backup. Upon arriving at the scene, they discovered it to be a small group of children playing water tag. This is not to paint the police as dishonorable, but simply fallible. It was just a culture of hide your sorrows and suck in your gut in the city, and to disagree was to show weakness. Again, we must consider the point of view of the average resident. To know even a fraction of their livelihood, we must see with unmitigated revelation their childhood. during which their fathers would have dissuaded them from quitting anything once begun, where jobs were to be held from the end of high school until retirement, where success was to be found in the anemic, duty-driven enterprise, and one's honest feelings were to be hidden. This all sounds ineluctably harsh, yet these were the conditions in which many people, especially the men of Blainesville, were raised into. Also, they were brought up in such a way that they could almost numb themselves to Mr. Singer's waylays without 1 ounce of dignity being lost. So, following a more proper elucidation on the working class of West Blainesville, we may confidently return to our story. As Mr. Singer finished hammering out his tirades, Cameron's heart sank, and he felt anxiety take hold of him. He had already been in low spirits before Mr. Singer's announcements and sought to find solace in his good friend Robin, a regular-looking man, a few years younger than Cameron, with dark blonde hair, slim, tall frame, an average, almost comedic-looking face, and a somewhat awkward gait, which he used to his humorous advantage. Robin joined him by the water cooler, the only place where opinions could ever be voiced somewhat freely without the looming air of management being present. "I just don't understand Mr. Singer at all. It's impossible to please him. His standards are so high, and you can't predict what he wants next," said Cameron, his eyes searching for looks of pity in his friend, but finding instead a carefree, easy smile. That man's quite the character, isn't he? Don't worry about him. He's all bark and no bite. Some time back he told me in not-so-polite terms to stop using the copier for personal reasons, and I told him to saw it off. Remember that? You can't tell us what to do. We're freer than he thinks." Robin said this with gleeful eyes, evidently proud of his assumed victory. "You did?" "No, I must not have been there." Cameron's ears peaked. "What did he do about it?" "Nothing. Well, at first he was speechless. Then they told me I had a 2-week leave with no pay. But I didn't care. I'm not stooping down for him like some type of dog. I couldn't care less of what that big ape thinks. He's irrelevant, old, and behind the times. In 10 years' times, there'll be a supercomputer here to replace his job. And I guarantee you the only reason he's here is because his father was as rich as a Wall Street broker. I heard he got into investing stocks, hit a lucky streak, bought this company, and never had to do any real work ever since. Now, of course, old Singer probably spent most of it on gambling or tipping off sexual harassment accusations. But that's besides the point. The man has never had to work for a living, and now he's a supervisor forcing everyone else around him to do his bidding like little puppets." When Robin said the word puppets, he theatrically gestured his hands in such a way as to mimic a Punch and Judy show. As he finished his task, he took a long sip of water from the cheap, tiny cone cups that were offered by the office, his already comical face being warped by the plastic jug. "So you really don't care what he thinks? How do you manage? I've been here over 14 years, and he hardly knows I even exist," Cameron asserted, not without some sense of embarrassment. "Comprende, isn't that great? If he doesn't know you exist, then you're pretty much free to do whatever you want," said Robin, tossing his used cup at the trash can but missing. "It's not like that. It's not that simple," said Cameron. "I mean, the man is just doing his job after all. That's important. It's a tough call, but it has to be done, and maybe he's gutsy for it. Maybe that's what sets him apart. Look, don't take this personally, but you need to really consider what Mr. Singer thinks of us. He doesn't care about you, period. Let that sink in. Question. Do you know how much money our saintly Mr. Singer grossed last year during this job?" "No, I don't," Cameron said, absent-mindedly, almost missing the question. $120,000. That's about twice as much as either of us make if we're lucky. And he makes it on the backs of hard-working folks like you and me. Another question for you. What percentage of dual attorney and company's spending budget is spent on office maintenance, supplies, and insurance?" "A measly 17%. To put that into perspective, they spend twice as much on catering. In fact, your sweat from this idiotic AC situation is proof of it. To put it simply, they don't have the slightest care in the world for people like us. We are pawns. We do our jobs, they get paid. We get paid. Unethically, of course. And they make the riches. They want us working overtime without pay and use a whole host of other questionable methods while they get paid to sleep around like babies because they're egomaniacs. They're drunk on power. That's what it's like to be rich. I've heard that a lawyer is not only supposed to speak the truth when it's most convenient, but it looks like here they never speak it, even if it is convenient." These thoughts had clearly been marinating for a while, and now Robin finally had a chance to express them, so he had a certain inarticulateness to his speech, but he was seemingly heated with ardor. One of the predominant reasons why Cameron talked often with Robin was for this: his unusually off-the-cuff yet candid remarks about anything ranging from office hypocrisy and flaws to life in general. These were topics about which many others in the office remained adamantly tight-lipped, and to see Robin speak like this gave Cameron a certain satisfaction. "That makes sense," said Cameron, though most placatively, as not to upset Robin's flow of speaking. In fact, Cameron was so aware of these facts that he could almost not bear hearing them for the umpteenth time. It figures that whenever a company bigwig puts a light behind your butt to get you going, it's mostly just to make them look good. They're only interested in their personal gain, right? Cameron looked cautiously around him in case an employee was eavesdropping. However, Robin didn't respond. He was lost in his thoughts, his eyes glued to the window, which was scattering midday light through the usually gloomy office, looking as if he were cogently planning his escape. Suddenly, he looked to have refocused his attention. "Sorry, what's that you said? I was dozing off," he said, recomposing himself. "It's nothing. I've got to get back to work," said Cameron, stretching his limbs out. "Me too. I said I don't care what people think, but not enough for me to get fired, at least yet." And with that, he let out a long, hearty laugh. Robin was a man in high spirits, which is exactly why Cameron enjoyed being around him and was able to talk to him without fear of repercussion, as opposed to a typical coworker who seemed to always be in constant severe judgment of him. Robin was both lauded and viewed with skepticism in the workplace for his personality. He was both fun to be around and maintained a substantial, if not blatantly vitriolic, criticism against the status quo of the office. Lately, however, it appeared as though Robin had been slackening in this characteristic jovial, carefree, and analytic manner. Though it was difficult to notice, Cameron could tell that Robin was telling his jokes with a degree of uncertainty, as if he were being watched, which he probably was. Robin had also been doing the same superfluous tasks, not for Mr. Singer directly, but vicariously. For instance, he had spotted Robin staying overtime, filling out documents that didn't pertain to his direct workload, and having them ready by the next morning. Not many workers did such extra tasks in the office, not unless they had a guarantee of advancement or partiality. Nonetheless, Cameron didn't dare upset the rare flow of equanimity in the office by challenging Robin with these suspicions. For all he knew, he could have a pertinent issue with a family or general life fluctuations that necessitated a sudden increase in pay. As open as Robin seemed to be with all his wit, Cameron didn't actually know all too much about him. He really only divulged his opinions and some of his hobbies, but rarely shared what was going on in his own life. On the way out from the double doors of the office as he left for lunch, following a Pavlovian instinct about the time, as though a bell had rung, Cameron made his way to his car with a feeling of relief, though short breaks such as these never felt long enough. Cameron spent the majority of his break in his car, as it were relatively cool and he wished to escape the stuffy atmosphere of the office. Before he knew it, his 30 minutes were almost used up, and with a few minutes left, he began to trek to his car to back inside. In the parking lot, Cameron caught sight of Cecil, a young woman he thought quite highly of, who had once worked in the same office building in the mailroom area downstairs. At this point, he didn't see her much, and assumed that she had either quit or had been relocated within the same firm. He had formerly met her, but hadn't really talked to her more than a few occasions, as the area where she worked was closed off from everybody else, for the most part, and they saw each other only at the beginning and end of the day. There had been one occasion when Cameron had the good fortune of carrying some memos over to her booth, a usually tiresome encounter that livened up his day if he had the chance to talk to her. They had a fruitful, pleasant conversation, and though it had only been a few minutes, it was a significant highlight for Cameron. He would replay that conversation in his head countless times over. The easy effortless it had, her optimistic yet realistic outlook on life, the places she had traveled to, and the myriad of adrenaline-inducing experiences she sought after, such as skydiving, skiing, despite not looking like someone who enjoyed these kinds of hobbies at face value, and how boring Cameron felt his life was in comparison. Yet she never made any such judgments. She seemed devoid of hasty prejudices and assessments of others. On top of that, she was generous with her time and never complained, though she could be slightly naive about the nature of some people, especially in Blainesville. However, her trustfulness was not any kind of miscalibration, but a standard foible one could find in everyday people. She had originally come from a more prosperous area, which isn't saying much in contrast to West Blainesville, and was not as conversant with the harsh truths of a place such as this. She was a few years younger than Cameron, in her early 30s, and had a very affable, easygoing placidity to her. A soft, warm smile that was not overly cloying or tacky, and though she had some minor wrinkles and creases, she did have elegant, beautiful features that she presented modestly. Her eyes were dark and glowed with a certain solemn gratitude and acceptance of the way things were, though it was difficult to tell, due to her donning a pair of prescription wide-rimmed glasses, as her eyesight was marginal at best. Her hair was light brunette and ran to her shoulders, and she had a somewhat petite build. Though she had trouble admitting it, Cameron was hesitant about approaching her, especially when he felt low in spirits and the daylight seemed to be embellishing the traits he feared the most: partial hair loss, pale skin, overly shabby, moth-eaten clothes that suffered under the pressure of cramped office work. He had more rips in them than he could count, and even considered wearing heavy-duty khakis, but they were forbidden under Mr. Singer's dress code. "Someone might confuse me for a factory worker," he commented wryly to himself. Seeing that Cecil was probably out for lunch too, he summoned up the courage he needed to speak to her, as he figured that his opportunities were scarce. For all he knew, this could be the last time he saw her, so he mustered within himself a feeling of carpe diem, and he approached her, not without trepidation ringing throughout his body. For all he knew, Cecil could be transferred to a different sector of the firm at any time, as was often the case with the receptionist. He waved over to her casually as he could. She didn't notice at first, as she was turned almost completely away from him. Feeling pangs of panic, Cameron opted instead to shout her name, although, when he tried, his voice came out frail and thin. Nevertheless, she turned her head, revealing her wonderfully pulled back locks of hair that had at one point been a light brunette, although she had added some kind of highlights some months ago. Now it was obvious, by the prevalence of brunette, that it was her natural color, and it suited her, Cameron thought. In her left hand, she had her phone, which she took from being nestled closely between her shoulder and chin, holding her bags in the other hand. This made Cameron queasy about having inconvenienced her. When she put it away, however, his hopes were renewed, and she acknowledged Cameron's greeting with a wave and a thoughtful hello. "Isn't it wonderful outside?" Cameron asked, trying to break the tension on his part. "Oh yes, it's amazing. The trees are starting to gain their leaves again. I'm sorry, what's your name again?" she asked, not seeming rude. The terms on which they had interacted had been informal, yet too brief to establish any recognizable traits. "I'm Cameron. It's all right if you don't remember. We talked once or twice before," he said, hoping that these memorable conversations weren't merely a one-sided illusion. "Oh yes, that's right," she exclaimed. "I do remember now. You stopped by to drop off that big stack of writ of certiorari. To your credit, I think you apologized for leaving me with such a thankless task and repaid me by coming back with coffee." "Right," said Cameron, his tension mostly subsiding. "I thought you deserved something in return for putting up with those sudden demands." "Oh no," Cecil replied. "It's not your fault. The supervisor has complete say in what you do, I understand." "Yes, I wish it weren't the case, but you are quite right. Anyways, I haven't seen you around recently. Where have you been?" As it turned out, they transferred me to the third floor, committee room, where I pretty much do the same thing. Same job, different place. Cecil looked somewhat demurely, as if she were doubting her own occupation, but Cameron could tell that she wasn't one to be bitter about her work. He realized he had only seen the surface-level view of her life. He didn't quite know the faults, misgivings, perks, imperfections, and overall complexities, though he wanted to know her better, to get beyond that reductive, thin veneer of each other's lives. "Well, at least you're out of the mailroom. That's a promotion in my book. I know Mr. Singer isn't inclined towards special treatment, so you must really be a hard worker," said Cameron, not certain if he was in any position to make jokes about his boss. "But then again, who am I to joke about it?" he added modestly. "That's true, but I haven't gotten to drink your wonderful coffee again," said Cecil, giving a wide yet authentic smile. "As far as Mr. Singer goes, though I haven't crossed his paths with him enough to hold any grudges, the way he treats people here is abominable. I think he's only soft on me because he knows he won't get away with mistreating a younger female employee. But I can't stay in a climate like this for much longer." She said this with a degree of righteous judgment. "You feel the same way about him, too?" Cameron asked, to which Cecil nodded eagerly. "That's surprising. This office is so tiny, though Mr. Singer constantly speaks of expanding our work to new horizons, that I feel like anything that happens here is like an isolated, almost unreal dream, and we're not quite in the real world. It's as if everything that goes on here is only a nightmare. A very boring, long series of events, but a nightmare nonetheless. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to wake up for it. I see what you mean, said Cecil. Listen, don't feel as if you're alone in this. We are in this together. Just because you feel small and unworthy in an environment like this doesn't mean that there aren't people out here to help you to make it suck a bit less. I know there's something better out there for you. There just has to be. This world is such a big place, so much bigger than just Blainesville. She said this with an affable air of confidence, and Cameron himself noted inwardly that she was dreamlike herself, but in the best way imaginable. She was the only spark of light in this dismal office, tucked away in this dismal town, and possibly in the world at large, which seemed to end at the gates leading up to both sides of Blainesville, as if it were another planet. People only left the city for brief vacations that scarcely felt long enough, and if people left altogether, they rarely came back to tell the tale. Thanks, said Cameron, his voice thin, not from his nerves, but from a bitter-sweet feeling of both hopefulness and melancholy, which oddly made him feel all the more comfortable around Cecil. That means a lot. I don't think I've heard those words in a long time. He exhaled slowly when he enunciated long time, and smiled warmly. Cecil appeared delighted that she had encouraged him. Well, you should, said Cecil. You deserve better. Just know that this job doesn't define you as a person. We base our opinions of others much too hastily on their income, wealth, or lack thereof, and how much of the social ladder they've climbed. I know that it's possible to work tirelessly, yet not achieve nearly as much as you envisioned. Take my brother, for instance. He toiled for almost a decade at this engineering job doing maintenance. He was qualified, overqualified even, yet he only got 2 raises and 1 promotion in his entire career, whereas other people with only a shred of his intelligence and competence saw more success just because they knew the right people. Exactly, replied Cameron. I don't say that only to toot my own horn, but we're so focused on one another's outer appearance of well-being rather than the core character of that person. I don't care an ounce about how outwardly successful someone is. If you only see one side to them, then it can't be used to measure their entire character. Though Cameron spoke with conviction, he felt as if he were saying something typical of himself. He certainly loved routine and familiarity, and the office, despite its disadvantages, did offer those things. However, he couldn't help but feel at odds with everything he had predicated his life on all these years, as if there was something within him swelling which he had to manifest somehow. Yes, Cecil exclaimed. True, sometimes our work does embody things like commitment, ethics, and organization, but most careers aren't geared towards attending to our individual needs. I agree. I wouldn't be so frustrated with this place if it weren't for the distinct lack of change and advancement. If I could at least be promoted to senior copier, or even the organ grinder's monkey rather than what I'm doing now, I'd be sincerely happy. If I could just get on Mr. Singer's good side, if he even has one. I feel like I could crack the code of how this place operates, whose hand to shake, and I'd finally be at peace. After Cameron said peace, his eyes wandered faintly beyond himself, as if the key to his queries lay beyond the confining gates of these familiar law offices, which in this particular light resembled a kind of industrial Valhalla, while so many other days it was like a mythical labyrinth. But at the same time, something within himself was aware of how unlikely and misinformed his dreams appeared. Well, Cecil said, breaking the silence, I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope so too, said Cameron, almost unconsciously. Suddenly, he remembered that he lost track of time. I almost forgot. I've got to get back to the grind, though I hate to cut this conversation short. He looked at his watch, wincing at his use of the word grind. Oh, don't get in trouble for my sake, she said, with an anxious expression. It was nice talking to you. Just remember what I said. Don't let this place get you down. I appreciate that. I'll be sure to get you that coffee. Your words have been really helpful, said Cameron, making his way to the small stairwell that led back into the offices, which were now split by the midday sun, with one side encased in darkness. Reflecting on his fruitful conversation with Cecil, Cameron felt his attitude drastically improve, despite the fact that he would still have to face the inscrutable Mr. Singer, that war-horse of an oaf who stood between him and every conceivable prospect before him. He felt his viewpoint in the coming days would be set on a trajectory toward considerable change. For now, however, these few positive words from Cecil were enough to brighten not only the rest of his day, but was decidedly memorable in its own terms. It was these tiny moments in between the drudgery of life that added to the piquant, pleasant flair of the otherwise dry routine. As Cameron pondered these sentiments, he gazed over the parking lot, that Robin had been gazing at in their earlier conversation, and was surprised to spot a flock of cardinals busying themselves with the garbage cans by the mail and the shipping entrance, where they were pecking at some food scraps. They waddled about and picked out bits of bread. Such funny creatures, thought Cameron, but they had the ultimate freedom to do as they pleased. They had no pressing issues or schedules to attend to, no burdensome life decisions to fret over. Though they didn't have the capacity for speech or profound thought, or any tactical modern gadgets available for their convenience, they could do one thing, which was to soar the skies uninhibited, and with such grace and independence. A bird doesn't need to wonder about what it ought to do. It just does it without hesitation, apprehension, or worry. It knows its place in nature, plays its part perfectly, and doesn't rush to get there. There is no schedule or life plan for a flock of cardinals, yet they know their position and place to a T and perform effortlessly. They have these preordained, assigned roles in nature, and they live them out without apprehension, guilt, or dread on what could have been. In this moment, Cameron longed for such certainty. Cameron, on the other hand, did not know exactly what he had to do. He was a befuddled man with no clear direction in front of him. He didn't know who to trust. Though he had devotedly worked at dual accounting for these past 14 years, he could not say they were enjoyable by any stretch. There had been moments of internal crisis and trepidation at the direction he was taking, but he had used the routines of office life as a kind of numbing medication to lessen these qualms. He had buried himself in the culture of work and reliability, never missing a beat. This had begun as something quite enjoyable in his early 20s, when the prospect of work had not yet weighed him down. Now, as he passed his middle 30s, he was of the opinion that he had essentially accomplished everything he set out to do, and everything else was superfluous. Even now, the culture of living to work ran like blood in the veins of everyone in Blainesville, even if they didn't truly believe so. However, every now and then, he would feel the inevitable rise of desolation run through him like an electrical current followed by a cool, salving draft. Cameron began thinking about the futility of this kind of life, though he scarcely revealed how he felt. He had a great deal to say about Mr. Singer. As dastardly as it might sound, in the furthest reaches of his mind, he could agree with Mr. Singer on one point, which was that he was something of a necessary force of intensity that the mundane office needed, if only to bolster the employees and to rile them up to get the work done and to follow the rules. This was the only vestige of sanity that people such as Cameron and his cohorts could muster up, but even this was no use now. Although Mr. Singer was a ruthless, overcompensating, incurious tyrant of a man, it helped, as Robin once put it rather thoughtfully, to consider that Mr. Singer was once a kid like everyone else, and perhaps deep down inside him fragments of a pudgy-faced cherubic child remain, although it couldn't help but elicit comical reactions from the workers. Similarly, even the most absurd water-cooler conversations employees had about him, in joking about how they could get rid of him given the chance, they would still agree that it would be helpful if the office perhaps had a shrunken version of Mr. Singer appear every morning instead, and yapped like a caged dog, with all bark, but no power except to bite at you, harmlessly with futile, capped teeth. Almost everyone in the office were greatly amused by the idea. In fact, Cameron laughed so much at the thought in his recent days, and when Mr. Singer was safely out of sight, that he almost cried. But there was no way to shrink him, unfortunately, and he was left only to face him full-sized with all his might.